Over the Atlantic, Navy pilots kept seeing something that seemed to move with impossible ease, silent, fast, and strangely indifferent to the laws they trusted every day. What was crossing their path out there? The mystery gathered around the US Navy training ranges off the East Coast, where routine flights became a place for repeated reports and uneasy conversations. In a world built on precision, the sky had started acting unfamiliar. Ryan Graves, a former Navy pilot, later described a pattern that refused to fade away. It was not a single strange moment, but a series of encounters that kept returning to the same airspace. What made the reports unsettling was not just the object itself, but the way trained aviators reacted to it. These were people who spent their lives reading the sky, and they were still left asking questions. The first layer of the story is simple. Pilots saw things they could not identify, and some of those sightings repeated often enough to become part of the unit's daily reality. That repetition is what pushed the case beyond a fleeting anomaly. Graves has said the object sometimes appeared stationary, then shifted position in ways that seemed abrupt and hard to judge. In the air, that kind of motion can make even experienced eyes hesitate. One detail that kept surfacing was the sense of scale. Witnesses described objects that were not tiny specks, yet not large enough to fit easy assumptions, leaving size and distance frustratingly uncertain. Another unsettling point was the lack of obvious exhaust, wings, or rotor noise. In the middle of busy military airspace, that silence made the sightings feel even more out of place. The reports did not come from one isolated observer. Graves and others described a pattern shared by multiple pilots, which is part of why the story kept getting harder to dismiss as a single misread moment. In later testimony, Graves described how these encounters affected confidence in the system around them. If something could appear in controlled airspace without a clear explanation, what else might have been missed? The setting matters because naval aviators are trained to notice what does not belong. Their work depends on speed, judgment, and trust in instruments, so a persistent unknown becomes more than a curiosity. As the accounts spread, the case began to shift from a private pilot concern to a public question. What exactly were these crews seeing, and why did the pattern seem to survive every easy explanation? Some sightings were brief, others lingered long enough for pilots to compare notes afterward. That after-the-fact comparison is where the mystery sharpened, because memory alone was no longer carrying the whole burden. The most compelling accounts centered on behavior rather than appearance. An object that can seem to hold position, then accelerate or reposition without a visible cause, invites a very different kind of attention. That is where the case becomes difficult to flatten into a simple misidentification. Weather balloons, distant aircraft, and sensor quirks can explain many things, but they do not always fit every reported detail at once. Supporters of the extraordinary interpretation point to the consistency of the testimony and the professionalism of the witnesses. They argue that trained pilots are not easily fooled by the ordinary sky. Still, the record is not a perfect window. Some details came from human observation under pressure, and some later explanations leaned on incomplete data, which leaves room for competing readings. That tension is part of why the testimony matters. It sits between certainty and uncertainty, where a pilot's instinct says something is wrong, but the evidence does not yet close the case. Graves later became one of the more visible voices calling for serious reporting and better data collection. His message was not that every strange sight proves a radical answer, but that the unknown deserves discipline. That request sounds modest, yet it carries real weight. If pilots are seeing recurring anomalies in restricted skies, then the absence of a clean explanation becomes its own kind of evidence. Skeptics question whether distance, lighting, and perspective may have exaggerated the object's motion or size. In the air, a small thing can become a giant question in a matter of seconds. That explanation remains plausible, especially when reports are brief and the sky is crowded with variables. Yet it does not fully erase the feeling that something unusual kept returning to the same place. The unanswered part is not just what the object was, but why so many trained observers felt the same unease. Shared uncertainty can be more revealing than a single dramatic sighting. In the end, the Ryan Graves testimony leaves us with a familiar kind of modern mystery. disciplined witnesses, recurring reports, and a sky that refuses to stay neatly explained. That combination is what keeps the case alive. Perhaps the final answer will come from better sensors, better reporting, or a mundane pattern finally made clear. But for now, the testimony stands as a reminder that the unknown can appear in plain sight. And if those Navy crews were right, then the most important part of the story is not fear, but attention. Something was there, something repeated, and the sky still has not told us everything. Before the testimony reached the public, the encounters were mostly discussed inside a world of briefings, flight logs, and quiet debriefs. That hidden phase is often where the strangest cases first take shape. The East Coast training environment was busy enough that almost anything could pass through for a moment. Yet repeated sightings in the same general corridor made the pattern feel less accidental. Graves has described the frustration of not having a clean category for what was being seen. When the options run out, pilots are left with a simple, unsettling sentence. Not sure what that was. That uncertainty is why the case resonates beyond aviation circles. It touches a larger question about how often extraordinary things might hide inside ordinary systems, waiting for the right witness. Even the strongest believers in the extraordinary reading usually stop short of certainty. They are drawn instead to the stubborn residue left behind when conventional answers do not quite settle the account. That residue is what makes the testimony enduring. It is not a finished revelation, but a carefully reported challenge to the idea that every strange thing in the sky is already understood.